Nothing noteworthy occurred for months, yet that's precisely what felt out of the ordinary. No unexpected announcements were made, not a big press conference, no formal declarations implying any disturbance. Royal responsibilities persisted. Schedules for the public were met. Well-chosen photos showed up at the perfect moment, stability on the surface. However, something subtle started to shift behind that exterior. Slowly, it grew more difficult to locate one familiar presence. Once the most talkative and often photographed of the Wales children, Prince Louis started to show up less and less. It didn't seem significant at first. An appearance that was missed. A family frame, slightly changed. A situation in which his name was still on the list, but his face was missing. One may disregard each moment separately. They created a pattern when combined. Furthermore, the regal narrative rarely contains coincidental patterns. The public festivities went on. The ceremonial duties proceeded. However, observers saw a widening discrepancy between eye confirmation and official itineraries. There was his name. His picture wasn't. As is customary in times of growing interest, the palace gave a reassuring response. Language, with a careful structure. Phrases that were comprehensive, but didn't provide much information. The explanations became quieter, the more inquiries arose. Slowly, the quiet itself started talking. People weren't upset because a young king avoided the limelight. It was the attitude that surrounded that absence, the feeling that it was improper, even discouraged, to inquire about it. Then the picture that changed everything appeared. A well-executed family photo meant to convey cohesion and affection instead attracted criticism. Online observers picked up on features like composition, location, and spacing that seemed a little off. The most talked about element, however, was easier. Who wasn't there? The conversation heated up. Analysis was done on frames. They asked shadows. We looked at proportions. In a succinct and restrained reaction, the palace mentioned a quieter period at home. However, that statement created more problems than it solved. A period of silence from what? Why now too? Behind the staged appearances and ceremonial routine, however, the general mood seemed to be changing. Catherine was also seen less often. She wasn't only avoiding public appearances, she was also attending them with greater caution. There was a shift, and the public had started to notice whether on purpose or not. Not just the general populace sensed a shift. Movement became more subdued behind the palace gates. Instead of using the customary ceremonial pathways, Catherine was seen entering through private access points. The level of security was changed. It was less obvious, but definitely increased. She was once seen leaving a pediatric medical center with rigorous security. No entourage, no formal briefing, no further explanation. At first, the image spread in silence. Then came the questions. Prior to the visit, no official comment was made. None later. Staff inside the institution stated that palace representatives had changed their tone. The length of conversations decreased. Access points become more secure. Protocols for communication felt less casual and more regimented. The strain beneath the surface became apparent to those used to the steady pace of royal coordination. Many things can be made smoother by tradition. However, it is unable to completely hide ongoing tension. Something seemed uneasy behind closed doors. Then, an unforeseen administrative mistake made things even more difficult. Unintentionally, a private internal document that was never meant for public distribution was emailed to more people than it was supposed to. Not disclosed. Not made public by revolt. Merely misguided. However, the repercussions were instantaneous. The tone of the language used in the text was clinical, detached, technical. It made reference to planned observation schedules, developmental monitoring, and continuous pediatric assessment. However, the contextual framing was what caught people's attention. Prince Louis was directly linked to the references. The ensuing procedural comments, which included directions on controlled disclosure, narrative containment planning, and strategic communication guidelines, were more worrisome than the language itself. These were expressions that were usually connected to crisis management in institutions, not the growth of children. The document had spread beyond its intended boundaries by the time royal officials realized their mistake. It was never fully published. However, pieces were observed. There was discussion about summaries. There was enough evidence to imply weight. Reaction was quick among the royal household as well. Systems of internal communication were strengthened. Permissions for access were adjusted. According to reports, longtime aides had their file privileges limited. They started administrative reviews. King Charles called a conference of emergency. Senior officials were consulted. Discipline in messaging was stressed. Response protocols that were unified were strengthened. The outward display of poise held firm. On the inside, however, the framework was buckling. Furthermore, containment becomes much more challenging once the questions transcend private corridors. Almost all of the senior officials were present when the emergency meeting was called. Almost. There was still one vacant seat. Catherine wasn't there. No official explanation was given, but it was said that no one in the room need one. There was no overlap in the schedule. The delay was not due to logistics. Distance was the problem. Additionally, distance frequently speaks louder than objection in royal dynamics. Speculation increased in the days that followed. It wasn't crazy, but it was persistent. When appearances did happen, observers started noticing minute changes in timing, body language, and posture. The impression that formed was one of pressure rather than bewilderment. For those who were paying careful attention, the issue seemed to be more about managing the narrative than it was about a transient disease. The diminished visibility of Prince Louis no longer seemed unimportant. It seemed well curated. Looks changed. The imagery became more vivid. References became softer. Deliberate framing ensued. And slowly, the perspective changed. Maybe this wasn't just protection, but containment. The discussion was completely altered by that distinction. Because vulnerability is shielded by protection. Reputation is protected by containment. The institution turned to its traditional foundation of discipline, hierarchy, and protocol as the strain increased. However, protocol does not eliminate emotion within the walls. According to internal reports, the emergency meeting that was supposed to stabilize messaging instead exposed underlying division. The tone deviated from the meticulously controlled serenity generally associated with senior royal debates, and some have characterized it as extremely blunt. Long regarded as one of the monarchy's most resolute and practical leaders, Princess Anne joined the issue with remarkable vigor. It was not a dramatic event, it was intimate. Close witnesses have reported that her intervention was based on principle rather than tactics. In the context of the conversation, the matter was now about family duty, rather than public appearances. The main query posed in that space was straightforward. When does upholding the institution start to jeopardize the family it stands for? According to reports, King Charles made an effort to regain his composure by highlighting the significance of institutional stability and cautious disclosure. His stance was consistent with the idea that not all internal issues call for public clarification. However, disclosure was no longer the only point of contention. It was all about trust. Because silence might increase suspicion rather than allay it once an absence is obvious enough to command public notice. And it became more and more clear during that meeting that unity was no longer taken for granted. They were negotiating it. It was not a procedural fracture. Relationships were involved. Additionally, protocol alone rarely controls the outcome when rifts reach the core of a family, even one that is connected by centuries of history. According to reports, the moment Princess Anne stopped speaking as a strategist and started speaking as family, the atmosphere in the room changed. She didn't make a dramatic argument. It was fundamental. She cautioned that a silence-based institution eventually runs the risk of undermining the same trust it is trying to maintain. According to her, authority cannot continuously rely on omission without repercussions. Something small but important had changed when she stepped out. Her allegiance had changed course, not evaporated. Furthermore, a change in allegiance might completely reset the dynamics of the royal family. She then went in search of Catherine in private. No advisors, not a single press handler, no official briefings, nothing that was discussed ever came to light. In the days that followed, however, the obvious result became evident. Catherine was no longer alone. Isolation might be strategically important inside the palace structure. However, alignment, even subtle alignment, changes the balance of power. Then, an unforeseen event made things much more dire. A handwritten note was discovered by Kensington Palace staff during what was described as a regular reorganization of private apartments. It simply had Catherine's distinctive script on it. There was no institutional branding or official stamp. The public was not the intended recipient of the message. It was addressed to William. Nothing suggested that it had ever been meant for discovery. It had an open, introspective, and intimate tone. According to later summaries by individuals who knew about it, the contents depicted a reality that was far different from ceremonial poise. It described spending long hours next to a child who was dealing with difficulties that weren't shown in official photos, regarding private consultations, of negotiating volatility in private while preserving external stability. There were sections discussing isolation, which is the state of managing vulnerability on the inside while projecting assurance on the outside. William was referred to as a father rather than a potential king. The letter detailed the times when formal responsibilities were put on hold, and parental anxiety persisted after the home had become silent. It mentioned how he sat next to Louis long after everyone else had gone to bed, unwilling to go, even when fatigue made it impossible. Among the readers, one passage in particular struck a deep chord. It conveyed the stress of feeling the ground shift beneath her family while still having to maintain composure. The letter contained no accusations. It didn't plan ahead. It came to light. Furthermore, containment becomes much more difficult when something very personal enters an institutional setting that is based on control, since emotion doesn't follow rules. And now it was more than just structured message. It was now a part of lived reality. William received the letter prior to the announcement of any public decision. At Sandringham, he read it by himself. Those who later came into contact with him did not speak of rage. Confrontation was not described. They spoke of silence, a clarity of a different sort. No conflicts were apparent. No hasty attempts at mediation. Subtle, but possibly more important, was what changed. William ceased to stand between the institution and Catherine. He took a step back, and he changed the equilibrium in the process. He had been negotiating the conflict between institutional expectations and personal loyalty for years. Those with knowledge of the matter now say that mediation was over. Catherine would make her own decisions. He also refused to obstruct it. Meanwhile, from a distance long regarded as politically complex, an unexpected figure returned to the discussion. Harry, Prince. He apparently saw the trend right away while watching the series of headlines and calculated quiet from overseas. Public poise, institutional prudence, personal stress. It was too much like his own experience to be disregarded. He didn't use formal methods to make contact, no middlemen, no coordination among the staff. He spoke with Catherine directly. By most accounts, they had a direct and unbroken discussion. Reconciliation and strategy were not at the center of it. The focus was on consequences. Harry talked as someone who recognized the personal toll that extended quiet took rather than as a commentator. The demand for self-control and loyalty. The deterioration that happens when messages from the outside contradict internal truth. Those who witnessed the conversation said his message was straightforward. While silence preserves structures, it can subtly harm individuals. The call does not cast doubt on Catherine. It strengthened belief. Hesitancy seemed to go with the discourse when it concluded. But inside the palace, there was still faith that everything would be resolved in time. That, as in the past, protocol and patience would win out. that presumption would turn out to be flimsy. The institutional reaction intensified as Catherine's stance changed from one of silent resistance to one of outward commitment. An instruction apparently circulated among a limited legal circle close to King Charles in the early hours before what was believed to be a scheduled personal address. Encrypted, time-sensitive, presented as a containment strategy, it had a procedural goal: wait, step in, avoid making a spontaneous statement. The palace was no longer in charge of optics at that time. It was trying to exert control. Furthermore, the contradiction becomes overt as an organization shifts from preservation to prevention. It happens instantly. The internal rationale was well crafted. It was not said that Catherine was defiant. It was said that she was emotionally unstable. Within institutions, language is important. In this instance, the phrase gently repositioned her as someone who was reportedly too impacted to act on her own initiative, rather than as a mother making a thoughtful choice. Something more profound than caution was hidden beneath such wording: fear. Dread of what revelation would disclose about the institution itself, rather than just a dread of disclosure. According to reports, advisors started looking into procedural options. Interpretations of the law were reviewed. There was discussion of a little-known clause that is rarely brought up and has lain dormant for a long time. It might provide the sovereign the authority to temporarily censor communications that the Crown considers to be unstable. Even with ardent supporters, hesitancy emerged. This was no longer tradition. It was similar to confinement. Furthermore, once containment is apparent, perception is irreversibly changed. Then William was under strain. They called for him. It was a calculated appeal. It focused on his future position. They emphasized the vast arc of institutional continuity. The reasoning was straightforward. Now step in. Maintain stability. For centuries to come, defend the crown. However, there was no negotiation that ensued. It was a rejection. William's reaction, according to reports going around among those in attendance, was straightforward and unambiguous. An institution's viability needs to be re-examined if it cannot tolerate honesty. The course was altered at that point. It eliminated the last line of defense between institutional opposition and Catherine's choice. However, a more subdued source provided the real turning point. Conscience above conformity was chosen by someone in the system. Details of the planned intervention were disclosed to a journalist who prefers balanced reporting to sensationalism by a royal staffer, who was apparently uneasy about the attempt to silence Catherine. The narrative progressed swiftly, through believability rather than conjecture. The story was reframed by headlines in a matter of hours. On the outside, what had been framed as stability protection seemed like an attempt to keep a mother quiet. The public's response grew more intense. Support quickly gathered on social media. Concern was voiced by those who hardly ever spoke about royal affairs. Unease was indicated by former insiders, who were usually restrained. People who had previously thought of the monarchy in terms of continuity started to ask new questions. The palace was unprepared for the magnitude of the response. Statements were prepared in draft form, updated, stopped. Lines of communication slowed. Then it became quiet. Silence seemed less intentional for the first time in this developing series. It looked unstable. The palace's response was quick and evident. Schedules for public appearances were subtly eliminated. Events were postponed without providing a thorough explanation. King Charles moved to Balmoral under the official pretext of introspection, withdrawing from public view. The reality, however, was more obvious within the institution. Control over narrative had broken down. Catherine stood in the middle of that crack. There was no ceremonial setting when she finally made her appearance. No balcony in the palace, no heraldry, no staging that is symbolic. It's just a blank room, as well as her voice. She didn't use the language of the institution. She did not use clinical language. There were no theatrical flourishes, no strategic allegations. As a parent, she spoke. She talked about nights when she couldn't sleep, the missed benchmarks, the slow realization that their son's life would not turn out the way they had envisioned. She then verified what had long been rumored, but never publicly acknowledged. An unusual neurological disease was identified in Prince Louis. The disclosure was straightforward. It wasn't exaggerated or sensationalized. However, the diagnosis wasn't the only thing that changed the mood. That was the next step. Catherine admitted that she had been told again and time again to be quiet. Personal transparency had been subordinated to the preservation of that institution. She spoke of sessions in which emotional issues were reframed as a risk to one's reputation. There were times when duty took precedence over empathy. She didn't give names. She didn't have to. There was no mistaking the implication. In her experience, a protective institution had opted for containment. The sentence that followed broke the usual barrier between monarchy and popular sentiment. Louis remained their delight, she said, that he would never travel the road alone, no matter what it was. There was no hierarchy in that moment. Titles dwindled. Protocol lost its significance. All that was left was a mother deciding to speak rather than remain silent. The reaction was quick and worldwide. Her entire speech was rebroadcast by broadcast networks. Across continents, messages of sympathy swept through. Vigils were organized out of empathy rather than protest. They lit candles. Louis's name was pronounced like a child's, not as a headline. The palace had not just let the story slip from its grasp. It no longer believed that emotion could be controlled. According to reports, the culture within the organization changed from one of strategic containment to one of existential calculation. Because truth does not withdraw into controlled silence once it is expressed in public. It changes everything in its vicinity. One question persisted in the palace hallways as the country processed the seriousness of Catherine's remarks. When moral clarity emerges from within an institution, what happens to it? The monarchy had previously survived controversy. However, this was not like the others. This was not a mistake that caused controversy. It was a conscience-driven reckoning. Furthermore, the aftershocks were just getting started. After then, a quantifiable change occurred. Outrage did not cause the public's trust to crumble. It became more doubtful. There was no shouting of the questions. They were heavier since they were asked in a calm manner. Why had this information been kept secret? Why was a mother supposed to bear all of this alone? It was difficult to overlook the magnitude of the response within the palace. Under the formal language of meditation, King Charles temporarily withdrew from public view and curtailed his public engagements. That gesture was unusually significant for a rule that was still in its early stages. Previously employed as a tactic, silence now carried connotations. William and Catherine, meanwhile, came to their own conclusion. They declined ceremonial responsibilities and scheduled appearances, not as a conflict, but as a pause. An unwillingness to present a picture of flawless stability while the people processed the information. The decision strengthened support rather than weakened it. Respect evolved from sympathy. Conversations that had been postponed for a long time started behind the palace doors. Debates over the function of royal offspring, regarding whether visibility has become a source of strain, regarding whether tradition had started to eclipse humanity in its preservation. Once radical ideas came to the fore, redefining public exposure, rethinking what true protection in a contemporary monarchy means, and reorganizing expectations for royal minors. Parliament joined the discussion outside the institutional doors, bringing up issues of accountability and transparency. The monarchy, which had previously been shielded by custom, was now under scrutiny that was more influenced by moral considerations than by scandal. One reality emerged among ambiguity. Catherine's reputation has changed. She was no longer only seen as a future queen who was prepared for ceremonies. Many saw her as a person of quiet resolve, who preferred clarity over containment and openness above comfort. This change was reflected in headlines. Not due to ancestry, however, due to conviction. Naturally, speculation ensued. Whether this moment will hasten structural transformation at the highest levels was a point raised by observers. If William's ultimate rule would be influenced by a more open-minded ideology than the one it inherited. Few replies were provided by the palace. However, the questions were no longer within its control. What started out as a covert conflict turned into a pivotal moment for an institution that had been long sustained by distance, not just for one family. The monarchy was not overthrown by Catherine's voice. It revealed its weaknesses, and they could not stay abstract once they were lighted, because truth does not disappear when it is hidden for the sake of appearance. It waits, and when it does show up, it does more than just cause trouble. It changes. Please support the channel and carry on the discussion below if this study provided a fresh viewpoint on the royal realm.